Hello and welcome to History Cross Tech. I'm Tech Elf, and on this channel I explore fascinating history topics and look at some of their modern connections that might surprise you. Today I want to tell you about one of my favorite topics, the London Frost Fairs. What's that, you ask? Well, did you ever hear about that time the River Thames in London froze solid and an elephant walked across it? Yes, a real elephant. When they roasted an entire ox on the River Thames in the freezing winter, and there was a printer selling souvenir cards that King Charles II bought? No? Well, gather round and listen in, because it's one of my favorite stories. And every time I'm in London in the winter, and I go to the Winter Wonderland in Hyde Park, I remember the story of the London Frost Fairs, where this idea of a frozen, frosty city kind of began. Well, the most famous frost fair happened during what's known as the Great Frost of 1683 to 1684. The River Thames in London froze completely solid for 2 whole months in the wintertime. The ice, it reached about 11 inches thick, and there was solid ice apparently extending for miles off the coasts of the southern North Sea. Now, within days of this freeze, people kind of recognized a cool opportunity and began constructing what amounted to basically a temporary city on the river. There was this guy called John Evelyn, and he kept these detailed diaries, and he'd write in the way they would write at the time that, coaches piled from Westminster to Temple in London, and there were horse-drawn coaches running regular routes across the ice as if it was a normal London road, I guess. But it wasn't just the transport and the horses going across the ice. And side note, I hope their little hooves didn't get too cold. But anyway, it wasn't just transportation. There were shops, little stalls, entertainment venues. The guy that wrote the diary, John Evelyn, he mentions that there were sleds, sliding with skeets, there was bull baiting, horse and coach races, puppet plays, and interludes, cooks, and other things like that. And his description really makes it sound like there was a carnival that had taken over the river on this solid ice that had frozen. And I guess, it was like this makeshift market. People would use sails and masts and the oars of watermen's boats. They had charcoal fires inside for heating. And in the main street, they called it Friesland Street, which is, kind of a very apt name for a frozen street. And the reason, you might be wondering, how did this happen? Why does the River Thames in London not freeze anymore? This is ridiculous. Well, you see, first of all, the old London Bridge is what made this possible. It was a medieval bridge built between 1176 AD and 1209 AD, and it had 19 closely spaced stone piers. These piers acted like a dam, slowing the river's flow upstream and reducing the water's salinity, which would have normally prevented freezing. So when the temperatures dropped significantly and the slower moving, less salty water, it froze more easily and also stayed frozen longer. The bridge essentially created this platform of frozen ice for this winter market to exist. And people kind of saw an opportunity, suddenly it wasn't a river on the Thames, it was solid ice. You could walk over it, and the opportunity popped up. There was this guy during this time in these winters and the frost fair, there was this guy called Kroom, and he really was quite entrepreneurial. I feel like if he was alive today, he would be in Silicon Valley. He decided to sell personalized souvenir cards because, of course, this wouldn't last. I mean, soon enough, spring and summer would come around and the frost fair would disappear. It would be nice. It would be really nice to have a souvenir. So he would sell these little souvenir cards for 6p each. You could get a little card printed with your name, the date, and the phrase, "printed on the River Thames." And what's interesting is he was making £5 a day, which in that context was serious money. It was about 10 times what a labourer would earn in an entire week. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, even King Charles II himself came to the Frost Fair and bought one of these commemorative cards, which must have been quite good for business for Croom. But there was also quite a variety of goods and services on this river. You know, they were selling roast beef, plum cake. You could follow it with some beer, ale and brandy, maybe some French wine or some Spanish wine. And there was tea, coffee, chocolate, all sorts of things, and little taverns that were given colourful names like the Whip or the Eggshell. And it was great, and accounts say that there was an entire ox that was roasted whole for public consumption on the River Thames. So I guess it's all really fun. But for me, what strikes me about all of this is how quickly this opportunity was seen by the people of London, and these commercial ventures existed. And there weren't just little market stalls. You know, people were transporting heavy equipment like printing presses onto the ice and setting up, food and drink, entertainment, and it was quite a scale. So that was pretty cool. I love that story. It didn't last though. The last Great Frost Fair happened in February 1814, and it only lasted 4 days, unfortunately. But it showcased what people had learnt over centuries, 200 years of deploying these temporary markets on the River Thames when it froze. Although it was only 4 days, it was, people got everything up there pretty quickly. That final Frost Fair, it was a pretty memorable moment because that's when they led an elephant across the frozen River Thames below the Blackfriars Bridge. Obviously, it was spectacular entertainment, but also it was pretty dramatic proof of the ice's strength and I guess load-bearing capacity. Can you imagine the crowd in 1814 that must have gathered to watch that? Pretty cool. So that was the last Frost Fair, and the fair came to an abrupt end on the 5th of February 1814 when the ice began to crack and break up. Unfortunately, several people drowned tragically during that thaw, which does highlight, the risks of building this temporary city on the ice. And, now at Winter Wonderland in London, people don't drown, much more safe. And the other reason I must add was at that time when the Frost Fairs happened, there was something called the Little Ice Age. It was a period of colder temperatures that lasted approximately from the 1300s to 1850. And that period was coming to an end. I guess it was the combination of warmer weather and also improved river flow that meant that the conditions necessary for the Frost Fairs couldn't exist anymore. But also, it wasn't just that. In 1831, the old London Bridge was demolished. That medieval bridge that allowed the water to gather and the Frost Fairs to happen, it was demolished. It was replaced with a new design. This new bridge contained wider arches, which was much better for ship traffic and general navigation, but it allowed the River Thames to flow much more freely. Without that damming effect of those closely spaced medieval piers, the river no longer froze solid, even during severe winters. The platform that had enabled centuries of these fun Frost Fairs simply disappeared. And I guess the modern analogy I would like to make is it's quite a clear example of platform dependency. You had these merchants, these businessmen like Croom who developed all this expertise, and then suddenly the ice thawed and they lost their platform. They lost all that specialized knowledge about operating on the ice that had been built on for a couple hundred years. All of it kind of became obsolete. Not because there was competition or different market forces, but because the platform that they'd built it on essentially the ice, ceased to exist. Anyway, that's the story of the London Frost Fair. Whenever I visit Winter Wonderland in Hyde Park now, I think about these frost fairs. And, you know, modern temporary infrastructure is obviously much more sophisticated these days. But I do wonder, you know, if it ceased to exist, what would people do? And I also remember those medieval Londoners, and I wonder what they did. Croom and the others selling souvenirs of the Frost Fair. I do wonder what they did once the ice thawed. But that's a story for part 2. Stay tuned for some new stories of my favorite medieval and historic topics. Again, I'm Tech Elf, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.